member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure to rise to speak on this bill. I should note that I'll be sharing my time with the member for La Salle-et-Mar. I do want to start on, I recognize, a negative note. Most of what is in this bill is indeed positive, but this bill is extremely limited in its understanding both of the needs of victims and the responsibilities of society through government to help victims. And so if we're all going to be supporting this going to committee and possibly voting for it at third reading, I think we have to make sure that the hype does not outdistance the reality, and that much work will need to be done on deeper issues around victimhood than this bill addresses. I may not go as far as leading lawyer Clayton Ruby has gone in calling this, quote, shallow symbolism, unquote, but I would agree with the first victim's ombudsman, Steve Sullivan, when he commented on April 3rd to CBC that the government has overpromised and underdelivered in this bill. And not to get into the crazy game of grading bills, but I guess I will, he said that he'd give this a C+ or a D- without even looking at what the government had been promising by in advance. The fact of the hype in advance means that he would probably give it an even worse grade. And by way of introduction, I would also note, Mr. Speaker, that one of the victim's mother, who spoke in Global News, said something that I think was extremely eloquent when she said, quote, beyond the sentencing stage of the process, the victims basically fall off the face of the earth, end of quotation. And that's not to say that that's entirely true about this bill, but that's generally the situation when it comes to how victims, including the family members of immediate victims, friends, and even the community, the neighbors of victims, are treated in our society. And this doesn't have to be the case. There are societies where a much more coordinated, holistic, and robust response to the pain, the grief, and the trauma caused by crime is actually dealt with more effectively than in Canada. One of the reasons it's not dealt with that effectively here has to do with one of the virtues of our country, that's federalism, which means that by and large this has been left as a kind of a social service in the philosophy of the federal government. The federal government has got involved in sporadic funding of post-crime victim support, but it is just that. It's funding, and it's not an attempt to truly create a national framework. Now, I first became aware of a limitation in the government's approach to victims of crime when early on after being elected, I was on the Justice Committee considering a bill that would increase offender surcharges. And a number of members of the committee clearly stated that between surcharges, that is ensuring that the perpetrators of crime pay, and provincial programs, the government's, the federal government's responsibility for assistance, that includes the need for programs and funding, basically ends. I felt then, and I feel now, that this is a highly inadequate view. It doesn't understand our jurisdiction federally over crime and criminal law. It basically leaves victims after the court process in terms of jurisdiction to create programs, and completely buries that responsibility within, as I said before, ad hoc spending power involvement. Now, I don't want to say there's nothing in the bill. There is an addition to this philosophy of perpetrators paying in sections 16 and 17 of Bill C-32. These are new restitution provisions that brings our criminal law closer to some civil law models, where every victim has the right to have the court consider making a restitution order against the offender, and then if that order is made by the judge, the order is entered as a civil court judgment that can be enforced against the offender. This is a welcome provision, but everybody will recognize that it has limits. It requires offenders who are capable of paying. And so the same problem we have with surcharges as being a very inadequate way to ensure, if you're focusing on the victim, that there is compensation, the restitution feature is only going to add another element to that, but will be far outdistanced by situations in which offenders, perpetrators who are convicted will not have the resources, and so the idea of a restitution order will have no meaningful impact on the kinds of compensation that can actually help victims deal with the trauma, the grief, picking up the pieces after their own victimization of a crime or that of a loved one. At around that time, I began to interact with a very inspiring woman in my constituency, Joan Howard, who had lost a son in 2003, so over 10 years ago now, to gun violence. He was shot dead in the hallway of a building in Toronto-Danforth with a handgun. Kempton Howard, after whom a park is named in our riding, was a role model to countless teens through his volunteer work at Eastview Neighborhoods Center's Boys and Girls Club. There he was a moderator of a junior leadership program, an after-school children's program leader, a summer day camp counselor, a youth basketball coach, and he was also a recipient, Mr. Speaker, of the Youth Ontario Services Award. Joan spent many years dealing with the trauma and then the long-lasting grief. And she began to ask herself, what could she do? Now, she has done many things. She has basically become part of a peer support system that I'll talk about briefly if I have time. But more recently, we've joined together for a petition campaign that has been tabled on many occasions in this House. And that petition basically asks the House of Commons to better understand that victims of crime, especially crimes of violence and crimes involving guns, include the loved ones of the direct victims. And that as a consequence, we need to create a meaningful countrywide system of public support for the loved ones of murder victims as well as for victims of crime who survive the crimes against them and ensure adequate funding for such a system. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that along with Reverend Sky Starr, who runs an amazing program called Out of Bounds, with the kind of the thematic subtitle of Grief Support from the Inside Out, a program that involves the mutual peer support model. Between Joan and Reverend Starr, I've become inspired, or at least better informed, about the need to take seriously trauma and then ongoing grief as something that destroys lives and whole communities. To that end, we had a teach-in here on the Hill, December 10th, 2013, which happens to be International Human Rights Day. A seminar on the Hill to which a number of MPs came from all parties. Not the Conservative Party, but the Parliamentary Secretary for Justice did send a staff member. The staff member seemed to have been extremely moved by what he heard and learned, and we hoped that this session would go back to the Parliamentary Secretary and then to the Justice Minister and factor into what we knew was coming as the Victims' Bill of Rights. Unfortunately, I don't believe that's the case. That said, I don't think that anything in the Victims' Bill of Rights precludes us moving forward in the future on better understanding the basic points that Reverend Starr made during that seminar when she said she outlined three crucial needs. One, there is a need for sustainable funding for grassroots organizations and resources to help the organizations find funding opportunities to actually help victims. Two, trauma-specific policies are needed to deal with the lack of trauma support that currently exists in communities. And three, recognition of grief as a mental health issue, and that has to be first and foremost a starting point, and that the grief and the trauma that flow from gun violence in many ways is very particular and very long-lasting. I'd end my comments, Mr. Speaker, by paying tribute to another member of my community, Jonathan Kahn, who was shot dead on the Danforth with a gun. I attended his funeral in a synagogue in North Toronto only a few months ago, and again had occasion to realize how easily lives are destroyed, not simply the lives of those killed, but those who survive them. And the only thing that propels people forward are support networks. We as a society need to help create those support networks and not rely only on families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.